Okay, so welcome back to our discussion on Unit 5, Revolutions. This is topic 5.8, Reactions to the Industrial Economy. So the thematic focus of this lecture is social interactions and organization. By the end of this lecture, I'd like you to be able to explain the causes and effects of calls for changes in industrial societies from 1750 to 1900. Historically, in response to the social and economic changes brought about by industrial capitalism, some governments, organizations, and individuals promoted various types of political, social, educational, and urban reforms. In industrialized states, many workers organized themselves, often in labor unions, to improve working conditions, limit hours, and gain higher wages. Workers' movements and political parties emerged in different areas, promoting alternative visions of society. Discontent with established power structures encouraged the development of various ideologies, including those espoused by Karl Marx and the ideas of socialism and communism. So let's talk about the conditions for industrial workers. Workers in the factories and mines and industrial areas suffered from incredibly poor working and living conditions. Working hours were typically very long and breaks were generally few and far between. The actual conditions inside factories and mines varied depending on the type of work, but generally speaking, there were no safety standards. This meant that there were poor ventilation, unsanitary conditions that led to disease, exposure to harmful chemicals, and dangerous machinery that could leave workers injured without any means of compensation or protection. In addition to these poor conditions, the labor was unskilled, so wages were so low that they often weren't enough to cover basic living expenses. Children, women, and minorities were also paid even less than their white male counterparts. These jobs did not come with benefits such as health care, retirement, or paid days off. The background image pictured here are cotton and textile mills in Manchester with visible chimneys in the 1840s. Manchester was called Cottonopolis because of the density of textile mills. So let's zoom in on those living conditions. Industrialization, it led to rapid urbanization. As city populations grew with factory workers, tenements or slums developed, which were cramped and often makeshift. Tenements and slums were characterized by high population density, no sanitation or bathroom options, irregularly shaped buildings, and narrow walkways. This cramped lifestyle without sanitation was responsible for a high rate of disease which spread, such as cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis. And pictured here on the slide is a crowded housing unit in London around 1870. This is an illustration of a tenement section in New York City from 1865. The sketch is by Albert Berghaus, who created drawings to illustrate what he thought were important events in American history. The next slide I'm going to show you is an image of an original magazine page where this was published. Before moving to the next slide, I want to propose a question. What do you think the purpose of this illustration might mean? What is the author trying to convey? I want you to think about that for a second. So once again, what is the purpose of this illustration and what might it mean? And what do you think the author's trying to convey? So looking at this slide and this image here from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, number 509, volume 20 from July 1st, 1865, If you zoom in on the capitalized text beneath the image, it reads, "Tenement houses of New York, how the poor live in crowded cities, how pestilence is generated, how the parents are demoralized and their children depraved, the great source of destitution and crime." What can you infer about the daily life of the average worker based on these illustrations? I want you to answer that question in your guided notes packet and be prepared to discuss it in class. So now let's talk about child labor. Child labor was a common practice during the Industrial Revolution, with children as young as 5 employed in factories, mines, and mills. Just like adults, they worked long hours, up to 16 hours a day, in unsafe and healthy environments. The reason so many children were put to work was because families needed the additional income, and children were seen as a cheap source of labor by factory owners. Children performed a variety of tasks that were often dangerous and exhausting, such as working machinery, carrying heavy loads, and cleaning and repairing equipment. Pictured here are 4 child miners in Prussia in the late 1800s, which illustrates how children were not spared from even the most dangerous and difficult jobs. So what are the responses to poor conditions? The important idea for you to get from this section is how poor working and living conditions contributed to movements and ideas for reform. The major ways in which reform occurred was through the development of labor unions, which were able to push for workers' rights and later for voting rights as well. Laws were passed that limit or prevent children from working in certain industries, and new ideas arose which were critical of the laissez-faire capitalism that drove industrialization. So we see a rise of organized labor. Labor unions began to form in Britain, although they first had to operate in secret because the government forbade the practice of organizing workers. Eventually, laws restricting the right of workers to organize were repealed, and labor unions began to win rights for workers. Pictured here is a poster issued by the London Trade Council advertising a demonstration that was held on June 2nd, 1873. And that takes us to a timeline of unions in Britain. Make sure to fill in the boxes in your guided notes under the timeline of unions in Britain, specifically for the year 1871 and 1842. So these are some of the key developments in labor unions in Britain leading up to the 20th century. More rights were won post-1900, but we're keeping within the unit's time period for now. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, you see the first small labor unions in some very specific industries. The combination acts with legislation that criminalized unionism, and those were repealed in 1824, which was a major early win for the right of workers to band together in unions, although they did not yet have any formal legal protection under British law at this point. Once these acts were repealed, it allowed for the growth of unions in the 1830s and 40s. In 1842, the Mines Act prevented all female children of any age and boys under the age of 10 from working in coal mines. In 1871, the Trade Union Act officially gave unions legal protection, and 4 years later, the Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act made it legal to strike and picket as long as it was peaceful. This is different than the 1824 decriminalizing of striking, because now the right to strike was written into law. All of these milestones led to new unionism in the 1890s, in which unskilled workers began to form large unions. These unions won many rights for workers in Britain after 1900, but all of the groundwork was laid pre-1900. Okay, so using this painting by Robert Kohler, I want you to try and answer the following questions. So take a few minutes, pause this lecture, really examine this painting, the details, the people in it, the background, all of these things, and try and answer the following questions. What is the location? What do you think the time period is? Who do you think these people are? And how do you think they are feeling? Or possibly what are they doing? Answer that, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So this takes us to voting rights in Britain. One effect of unions forming and winning rights in the workplace was the realization that they could have sway in other areas. In Britain, unions helped put pressure on the government to expand voting rights, which were generally reserved only for the privileged. The Reform Act of 1832, which the first Reform Act, expanded voting rights to more of the male middle class, not the working class in the industrial sectors. The Reform Act of 1867, which is the second Reform Act, widened suffrage being voting, by extending the vote to working class men in towns and cities. And the Representation of the People Act in 1884, which is the third Reform Act, further extended voting rights into rural areas. So now, while it's not important that you necessarily memorize these acts, what is important is that you are able to connect the gradual expansion of voting rights in Britain to the unions and a push for better conditions among the working class. And that brings us to reforming child labor. Throughout the 1800s, conditions gradually improved for children who were employed in factories and mines. The Factory Act of 1833 prevented children under 9 from working in textile mills and capped working hours to 12 hours per day for children aged 9 to 16. That's still a long workday for a lot of little kids. We had previously mentioned the Mines Act of 1842, which prohibited children under 10 from working underground. In 1847, the workday was limited to 10 hours for both women and children. One problem with child labor in Britain was that children had no time for anything other than working. In 1880, compulsory education was finally enacted for all children 10 and under. There was still a long road ahead to eliminate child labor, but these reforms marked the movement away from child labor in Britain. We have been using Britain as a case study for labor reform because they were the first to industrialize and therefore the first to grapple with resistance and reform among the working class. So it takes us to criticisms of capitalism. Pictured here are two prominent thinkers that criticized laissez-faire capitalism as it manifested in the Industrial Revolution: Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. Marx was a German scholar, and Engels had direct experience with the workings of business and industry. They met in Paris in 1844, and their lifelong partnership began. The pair is most famously known for writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848. This document would go on to have major influence in new systems of government in the 20th century, which we will see as we move into the next time period in this course. As a response to capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, these two figures are responsible for important key ideas explored on the slides coming up. All right, so let's discuss the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels argued that capitalism essentially created two major classes of people: the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. The proletariat is the class of workers who do not own any means of production, which means they don't own factories, lands, or materials to make goods. They only have their own labor to sell to make a living. In simpler terms, they are the working class who work for wages. The bourgeoisie is the class that owns the means of production. This includes factory owners, large landowners, and business people who employ workers. They are considered the wealthier class who benefit from the proletariat's labor. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels describe a struggle between these two classes where the proletariat seeks to overthrow the bourgeoisie to create a classless society where the means of production are owned collectively, not by individual business owners. This is the basic point of the Communist Manifesto. In your guided notes, make sure to fill in that section that describes the difference between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So here we have a painting titled The Iron Mill by Adolf Menzel. In your guided notes, I want you to answer these two questions. Number one, does the painting highlight the proletariat class or the bourgeoisie class? And number two, does this image illustrate any of the working conditions that we mentioned earlier in this lecture? So make sure you pause this lecture, look at the picture very closely, and answer those questions in your guided notes packet. So here we have a quote from The Conditions of the Working Class in England by Friedrich Engels in 1845. I want you to read the quote, which is also in your guided reading packet, highlight it, annotate it, and then answer the question in your guided notes packet that asks, to what does Engels attribute the growth of the proletariat class? So the Communist Manifesto is a foundational political document that lays out the principles of communism. Written jointly by Marx and Engels and published in 1848, this influential pamphlet presents an analytical approach to the class struggle and the problems of capitalism and the capitalist mode of production. It argues that all human history has been defined by class struggles, but in their contemporary era, this struggle was between the bourgeoisie, the capital-owning class, and the proletariat, the working class. The manifesto critically addresses the specific context of industrial capitalism. Marx and Engels observed that industrial capitalism brought about significant technological and economic advances, but at a considerable social cost. They critiqued the exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, who profited immensely from the labor of the working class. This exploitation was exacerbated by industrialization, which often led to inhumane working conditions, low wages, and the alienation of the worker from the product of their labor. In response, the Communist Manifesto advocated for the overthrowing of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, envisioning a revolution that would lead to a classless and stateless society. The ultimate goal, according to the manifesto, was the establishment of a communist society, free from class divisions and where the means of production would be owned collectively. This revolutionary document provided the theoretical basis for the later socialist and communist movements, aiming to address and rectify the imbalances and injustices perceived in the capitalist system of the time. Pictured is the cover of the first publication of the Communist Manifesto in February 1848 in London. So this was just part 1 of topic 5.8, and these are the key ideas that I would like you to write down in that separate notebook for studying and for your test, just as a quick reference guide. Number 1, the working and living conditions for the working class in industrial nations were very poor and wages were low. Workers had little to no protections and child labor was common. Responses to the industrial economy included the rise of organized labor unions, laws restricting child labor, the expansion of voting rights, and the development of the theory of communism. So this is the final key concept for topic 5.8. And pictured here is Mahmud II of the Ottoman Empire, who initiated reforms as a response to industrializing nations in Europe. Historically, in response to the expansion of industrializing states, some governments in Asia and Africa, including the Ottoman Empire and the Qing, China, sought to reform and modernize their economies and militaries. Reform efforts were often resisted by some members of government or established elite groups. So, Sultan Mahmud II. We will begin our exploration of responses to industrialization outside of Europe with the Ottoman Empire. So using this slide here, I want you to focus on the section in your guided notes titled Sultan Mahmud II. Looking at what we have here, what could the change in Mahmud II's clothing style tell us about reforms in general in the Ottoman Empire at this time? What influenced the change from more traditional Ottoman attire, pictured on the left, to the style of dress pictured on the right? One of the most notable changes Mahmud II brought during his reign was the abolition of the centuries-old janissaries, which were replaced with a more modern military. The janissaries were known for their moral discipline and elite soldier status. They were responsible for the defense of the empire and protection of the Sultan. However, by the 17th century, the janissaries functioned less as military elites and more like a privileged hereditary class. The general population grew discontent towards the janissaries because they did not pay taxes, but collected taxes from everyone else. Additionally, the janissaries had become so powerful that they were effectively undermining the power of Ottoman sultans. Mahmud II recognized this and began working on forming a new army for which he was recruiting European gunners. These actions resulted in an all-out mutiny of the janissaries against Mahmud II in the capital. The janissaries were forced back into their barracks. This event is known as the Auspicious Event, and it marked the official disbandment of the janissaries. All remaining janissaries were exiled, imprisoned, or executed. In 1826, the remaining janissaries in the empire were executed by decapitation, and many of these executions took place in the Thessaloniki fort, which gained the nickname Blood Tower. A new modern military corps called the Asakuri Mansura Muhammadiyah, also known as the Victorious Soldiers of Muhammad, was established by Mahmud II to guard the Sultan and replace the janissaries. Before Sultan Muhammad II's death in 1836, he initiated Tanzimat reforms, which were structured to bring the Ottoman Empire, quote-unquote, up to speed with industrialized European nations. The Tanzimat reforms sought to update education, the military, economic and taxation systems, government administration, the legal system, and civil rights and equality, all in an attempt to modernize. The Tanzimat period of reform was officially launched by Sultan Abdulmajid I, which is Mahmud's son and is pictured here on the slide, in 1839, with the Edict of Gulhain. These reforms continued all the way through 1876 with the establishment of the first constitutional era. And there was also education reforms. One example of these Tanzimat reforms that were modeled after European systems was in Ottoman education. Istanbul University, which is pictured here on the slide, was founded by Mehmed II in 1453 after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. In 1846, in the midst of the Tanzimat reforms, Istanbul University was reformed and modeled after European higher education institutions. This made the university the first in the Ottoman Empire that emulated European-style education. In addition to European-style schools, education in general became more secular and less under the control of Muslim scholars. This helped to expand educational opportunities to more people across the diverse empire. So let's examine opposition to Ottoman reforms, the Young Turks. The Young Turks, which we will hear about more in Unit 7 when we cover World War I, were a revolutionary movement composed of young military officers and intellectuals that emerged in the late 19th century. They advocated for a constitutional monarchy and the reinstatement of the 1876 Constitution, which had been suspended by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and they desired more radical political reforms than those introduced during the Tanzimat. The Young Turks saw the Tanzimat reforms as insufficient and ineffective in addressing the empire's decline. The movement had strong support within the military, which they used as a base to exert political pressure, and they successfully restored the Ottoman Constitution of 1876 through a military coup in 1908, leading to the Second Constitutional Era. Again, we will encounter the Young Turks again as we approach World War I in this course. So let's examine China's response to industrialization. Like the Ottomans and the Japanese, you may recall the Meiji Restoration from earlier in this unit, the Qing dynasty in China also saw Western industrialization as a threat, and this pressure spurred their own reforms. Pictured here is a Chinese arsenal built in 1865. So let's look at contextualizing the self-strengthening movement, the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars, comprising two major conflicts in the mid-19th century, served as crucial context for understanding China's self-strengthening movement. These wars were between China and Western powers, primarily Britain, and were centered around the trade of opium and China's sovereignty. The First Opium War arose when China, under the Qing dynasty, sought to suppress the opium trade, which was being aggressively promoted by British traders. The resulting war ended with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which imposed harsh conditions on China, including ceding Hong Kong to Britain and opening up several ports to foreign trade. The Second Opium War expanded to include France alongside Britain against China. It was triggered by further disputes over trade and diplomatic relations. The war concluded with the Treaty of Tientsin, leading to more concessions from China, including the legalization of the opium trade and the opening of additional ports to foreign influence. These wars highlighted China's military weakness and technological shortcomings compared to the Western powers. The humiliating defeats and the unequal treaties that followed exposed the Qing dynasty's vulnerability and the urgent need for modernization, setting the stage for the self-strengthening movement. This movement, initiated by Chinese officials in the late 19th century, aimed to modernize China's military, economy, and technology by selectively adopting Western practices while maintaining Confucian principles in governance. The Opium Wars will be covered more in detail in Unit 6, but this is just a quick introduction so we can see why China felt the need to modernize. So as I go through the next slide, make sure to fill in the box on your guided notes packets, the goal as displayed on this slide. So even though China invented gunpowder, its military capabilities were far behind those of industrial Britain. The two defeats in the Opium Wars made this painfully clear to China, and the self-strengthening movement was Qing China's answer to the problem. This movement to update China's military occurred in the late Qing dynasty and was a direct response to the Opium Wars and British and French military superiority. Much like we saw with Japan's efforts to modernize after the Perry expedition, China's encounters with Western militaries and fleets prompted change. The goal of the self-strengthening movement was to update the military while keeping Chinese traditional values and governance intact. Note, the Chinese characters on this slide are pronounced Ziqiang Yongdong, and it is the Chinese name for the self-strengthening movement. Pictured is a French torpedo launch attacking the Chinese frigate Yanyang in February of 1885. China had begun to update its navy fleets by this time. It's difficult to make out the picture, but the Chinese ship resembles a European-style ship. Okay, so as I go through the last slide on China's self-strengthening movement, I want to have you make sure to fill in the successes here. The first couple have been done for you. Make sure to fill in the final as I'm going through the slide. So the self-strengthening movement was led by key officials such as Prince Gong, pictured here on the left, Zheng Gufan, and Li Hongzhang and Zhang Zedong. These reforms were successful at advancing China in several key areas. Their military was updated with modern arsenals and new shipyards that produced navy fleets. Infrastructure like telegraph lines and railroad projects were undertaken. The mining and textile industries were developed. Education reforms encouraged students to study in Western countries and learn foreign languages, and Chinese diplomats were trained in international law. This last part was important as China attempted to renegotiate some of the unequal treaties that resulted from the Opium Wars. The movement wasn't without its challenges, however, as powerful conservatives resisted the move to more Western updates. These modernizations were thought of as threats to traditional Confucian values. Additionally, the reforms were most heavily focused on military and industrial modernization without much consideration for aspects of society, so the reforms were felt somewhat unevenly. So here let's take a look at some modernized Navy fleets. This is a quick visual of the change in Chinese ships. The image on the left is from the Opium Wars before the self-strengthening movement. The image on the right is of an ironclad battleship called the Zhenyang, which is part of the Baiyang fleet. The Baiyang fleet was developed as part of the self-strengthening movement. The end of the self-strengthening movement in 1895 occurs alongside the First Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1894. The war was fought between China and Japan over influence in Korea. China was defeated by Japan, who had successfully transformed themselves into a major world power through the Meiji Restoration. This defeat showcased the shortcomings of China's self-strengthening movement and highlighted a need to introduce further reforms and modernizations. Pictured here is a Japanese painting of a successful Japanese battle in the First Sino-Japanese War by Tashikata Mizuno in 1894. And that takes us to the 100 Days Reform. Emperor Guangxu reigned over Qing China from 1875 to 1908. He suffered the loss in the First Sino-Japanese War and other concessions to foreign powers like Kyushu Bay leased territory to Germany. This is why the Chinese city of Qingdao still has a strong German influence in architecture, and it remains a center of beer production. These events led to Emperor Guangxu initiating the 100 Days Reform. As I go through this slide, I'd like you to fill in the reform goals in your guided notes. The first couple, once again, have been done for you. Make sure to fill in the other two. And then also address the question on the right. What was the primary difference between the self-strengthening movement and the 100 Days Reform? So the general purpose of the 100 Days Reform was to rapidly advance modernization and to fill in gaps from the self-strengthening movement. There was more of an effort put into reforming education, including abolishing the civil service examination, establishing Peking University as a leading center of science and liberal arts, establishing agricultural schools in every province, reforming the basic education system to be focused on math and science rather than on Confucian texts, the establishment of a naval academy, and the encouragement of studying abroad for imperial family members. These major shifts in education would be at the center of opposition to the reforms, which we will look at on the next slide. In addition to all the education reforms and other major reforms included moving from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy and the further adoption of Western technologies. So let's examine the opposition to reform. Many traditionalists in the Qing court and bureaucracy were deeply suspicious of Western ideas and technologies. They believed that these reforms would undermine the Confucian values that were foundational to Chinese society and governance. Empress Dowager Cixi, pictured here on the slide, was arguably the most powerful political figure in China at the time. She held a conservative view of governance and was resistant to rapid changes. Cixi saw the reforms as a threat to her power and the traditional Qing hierarchy, which she had dominated for decades. Additionally, many bureaucratic officials who had risen through the ranks via the traditional Confucian examination systems saw the proposed reforms, especially in education and governance, as a direct threat to their status and influence. The loyalty of the military was a crucial factor in Cixi's successful opposition. She had cultivated support among military leaders, which proved to be a decisive factor in her ability to oppose the reforms. Empress Dowager Cixi, sensing the growing momentum of the reform movement, began to quietly prepare for a decisive intervention. She communicated with key military and political leaders, ensuring their support for her actions. Then, in September 1898, Cixi acted swiftly and decisively. She orchestrated a palace coup, taking control of the government. The Guangxu emperor was effectively sidelined and placed under house arrest at the Summer Palace. Following the coup, Cixi reversed most of the reforms that had been enacted. Reformers were purged from the government, and some were executed, while others fled into exile. And with that, we have ended our topic 5.A. This wraps up part 2 of this. I would like you to pay attention to the graphic organizer in your guided notes packets. This one is titled Reactions to the Industrial Economy 5.8. Start by answering the question, what were some things that led to the formation of labor unions? You'll see that moves down to the next question, which is, what were some of the results of the formation of labor unions? Then in the bottom half of the graphic organizer, I want you to explain the modernization and reform that occurred for the Ottoman Empire and the Qing China in response to an industrializing world. The Ottoman Empire should be filled in the left box, the Qing dynasty in the right box, and then explain the difference between utilitarians and utopian socialists in the context of responses to the Industrial Revolution. And as always, make sure to copy down the key ideas for review right here. Outside of the West, governments were faced with a reform or die scenario. They needed to modernize or face domination by Western powers. The Ottoman Empire abolished the Janissaries and implemented the Tanzimat reforms. The Young Turks opposed the Tanzimat reforms as superficial and inadequate. Qing China implemented the self-strengthening movement after defeat in both Opium Wars. The Hundred Days Reform was a response to further military defeat and concessions, and Empress Cixi opposed the reforms and staged a coup. Make sure you guys check out Heimler's Topic 5.8 AP World History Review. I'll put the link in the description, and have a great evening.